Well, welcome to this first lecture on care for community. And I thought I would start off with some great thoughts, awesome thoughts by George Bernard Shaw. I like these quotes from his splendid torch. He said, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little cloud of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy." I like that. It seems to me that at any moment, in any moment, we can complain about how things are or how things have been or how they will be, or we can decide to find something meaningful to do. The quote always inspires me to find something meaningful to do. He goes on to say, "I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be so thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I have got hold of for a moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to the future generations." We'll be talking this week, about community, and it's a noble thing to live for a purpose that is larger than yourself, right? To live for a purpose that transcends your own small ambitions. He also says, "People are always blaming their circumstances for what they are. I don't believe in circumstances. The people who get on in this world are the people who get up and look for the circumstances they want. If they can't find them, make them." And that reminds me of a quote by Sartre, who said, "Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you." Because in a real sense, true freedom, and the only freedom that we really possess, is the freedom to choose our response to any particular set of circumstances. Well, I am really excited to talk to you about community and care for community, how we can cultivate graceful presence to the various communities that we might be a part of. I thought of the communities that I belong to. I belong to a family community, to a school community, both my department and you, my students in my classes. I belong to a religious community. I belong to certain clubs and social organizations. So, what communities do you belong to? And think about those communities as we talk a bit more about care for community. First off, perhaps to define what I mean by community in this sense, and as you can see, it's any collection of individuals sharing common space and resources. And what makes them a community is that each individual needs the group in order to best satisfy his or her existential needs to be safe, secure, respected, and meaningfully free. So that's kind of the key part. You might be driving down I-15 or walking down a hallway with lots of other cars or people. You share certainly the common space of the highway or the hall and the resources, but you're not a community, because a community is that group of persons who really do depend and need one another to feel, again, safe, secure, respected, and free. And so we might perhaps go back and define those basic existential needs as well. A good review, right? Safety is our need to be free from violence, threats of violence, and threats to our existence itself. Security, every one of us needs to feel free from hunger, homelessness, and free to have access to education, healthcare, and work. We also have a need for respect. Every one of us wants to feel like we're valued and appreciated by others, as members of our community. And then finally, to be not just free, but to have meaningful freedom, that we're free to pursue goals and objectives we have reason to value, to become our best possible self. And to kind of summarize that, every one of us, I think, have the desire to become irreplaceable in the affection and the esteem of others. And I really do hope that you do have a community somewhere where you do feel irreplaceable in the affection and the esteem of others. So for these communities to be successful, they have to become places where each member has a real opportunity to flourish by coming to feel, again, safe, secure, respected, and free. And to do that, to achieve these needs, we need to learn how to cooperate with one another. And this might be the key challenge in communities, right? In communities, to live together in community, we each have to be willing to limit our own freedom to cooperate with someone else. We have to be willing to sacrifice some of our own wants for the sake of a greater good. I mean, I'm sure that all of you have things you'd rather be doing than listen to this lecture, but you sacrifice those private interests to cooperate with me and achieve the purpose of our class. Well, similarly, there are things that I'd rather be doing, I'd enjoy more than recording these lectures, but I sacrifice those private interests to cooperate with you. And as you can see on this slide, right, the benefits of cooperation, or a balancing freedom and cooperation, as we can harmonize the pursuit of individual goods and collective goods. We understand, right? We understand that if all of us as a community feel safe, secure, respected, and free, then each of us as an individual will as well. To balance individual freedom and self-restraint in doing for oneself and doing for others. We help others achieve what they need. We realize that if we help others achieve what they need, they're more likely to help us. That third point, right, to limit one's own behavior to seek human flourishing for all, we again realize that for any of us to do well at the expense of another will undermine, right, the flourishing of all of us. And then finally, the mindset that we want to create is to realize that our own well-being and the well-being of others are tied together. And I came across a great metaphor for this in Herman Melville's story Moby Dick. In chapter 72 of that great book, Melville recounts an episode where his narrator, Ishmael, in fact, I'll quote from this slide. Ishmael, the narrator of the story, tells how he and Queequeg were working together to slaughter a whale. Queequeg was standing on the slippery surface of the half-submerged well, which was a very dangerous position. If he slipped in one direction, he would fall in the gap between the well and the ship and be crushed. If he slipped in the other direction, the sharks waiting there would kill him. So to protect him, Ishmael stood on the deck of the ship, holding on to a harness that was attached to both their belts. It was called a monkey rope. If Queequeg began slipping in either direction, Ishmael would pull him back to safety. And the point is obvious. If Ishmael let Queequeg fall into the sea, then Ishmael himself would be pulled into the sea, and both would die. Ishmael reflects on the fact that their fates were wedded together. What happened to one would also happen to the other. This kind of community mindset, again, that we want to cultivate is to appreciate that we are, in fact, connected with one another. There is a figurative monkey rope that binds us all together in our communities, right? Our fates, our futures are shared. So we need to cultivate this ideal, right, of shared fates, of a shared futures, so that we might work together. This, of course, to produce this cooperation, even with this mindset, requires that we exercise power. So I think we need to first define power in that sense. And let's, for now, just say that power, in terms of community, is our ability to get others to cooperate with us. And as I've thought about power, there are a couple of questions we want to ask ourselves. One is, how do we exercise power? And two, why do we cooperate with those who exercise power over us? And as I've thought about this, and my basic inspiration here is from the writings of Robert Greenleaf, a great leadership consultant. He talks about 3 types of power, and you can see it displayed here. In fact, when you talk about power and how it's exercised, we also have to talk about, again, why we cooperate. I mean, if I would exercise or try to exercise power over someone and they refuse to cooperate, well, then I would be powerless. So we have to know and think about why we cooperate with others who exercise power. So we'll want to look at, again, the type of power, how it's exercised, why we cooperate, and the consequences of each. So as you can see, coercive power is exercised through threats, force, and threats of force. And it produces kind of a forced obedience out of fear, right? We cooperate out of fear of the threat or the violence that's threatened. The consequences, as you can see, of coercion, short-term success, long-term resentment. You have apathy, anger, rebellion. So coercion over the long haul, in the long term, is not sustainable. Then you have manipulative power. And of course, thinking about that, I'm sure that you've all been coerced before. You all know what it is to both be coerced and coerced. And I would imagine that none of us like being coerced, and yet we perhaps find ourselves at times threatening others. Then we have manipulative power. We exercise this through deception or trickery. We lie and deceive others to get them to cooperate with us. And this manipulative power, where we deceive or are tricky, right, or dishonest, produces blind obedience out of ignorance. Of course, manipulation, the consequences are, in the short term you might get what you want, right? So short term they will cooperate with the manipulation, but long term is loss of trust, disillusionment, weakened accountability. So again, manipulation in the long term is unsustainable. And again, I'm sure you've all been manipulated before. You know what it's like. I would imagine you don't like to be manipulated, and yet I would imagine you also have in times manipulated others. I know a quick story of where I learned kind of the downside of manipulation. Kind of a funny story. It has to do with one of my daughters when she was about 8. Before that time, again, we had often, my wife and I, used Santa Claus as a ploy to get our kids to do what we wanted them to around Christmas time. Maybe some of you had Santa Claus used against you like this as well, right? So your parents, or we would say to our kids, if you don't eat all of your supper or do what we ask you to do, then, Santa's elves are watching, the elf on the shelf, and you'll get on the naughty list. You'll have fewer presents at Christmas, whereas if you do what we want, you'll get a good report and good presents. So, obviously deception. I mean, hopefully there's no one listening to this who might still believe in Santa Claus. And if so, I apologize for breaking this to you. In any case, my daughter came to me one Christmas and she said, "Dad, I really need to know, is there a Santa Claus? I'm hearing rumors on the street. My friends are talking that he doesn't exist. I need to know, so tell me, please." And I decided that it was time to come clean. And I told my daughter, no, there is no Santa Claus. It's us, your parents who bring you the presents. My daughter, burst into tears, and she runs into her bedroom and slams the door closed, crying. She comes out a few minutes later, and she's drawn me this picture, right? You can see that it's a picture of her with these big tears falling down her cheeks. At the top of the page, she's written, "I've been lied to all my life," and she gave this to me. Quite a hilarious moment for me, though traumatic for her. But again, with manipulation, we'll eventually be found out that we were being deceptive or dishonest, and then all the trust is gone and our ability, our power to influence is lost. And I'm going to suggest that even though there might be times when coercion and manipulation are justified, that more often than not, they're unethical, that we should avoid coercion and manipulation in our communities. And so this brings us to persuasion, the persuasive exercise of power. It's exercised through logos, pathos, and ethos. We'll define those in a minute or two. You probably have heard that before. They always go back to Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, who said that we persuade others through these three means of logos, pathos, and ethos, which produce voluntary obedience out of respect. We respect the character and competence of the person who persuades us, and so we cooperate. Now, this takes longer to get to, right, but it builds trust and buy-in. And even though It might take longer. The persuasive use of power is the only type that I think is sustainable in the long term. Again, as I said, there are of course times and occasions when coercion or manipulation may be called for, but our goal must always be persuasion and care for a community. Even with children who may lack the intellectual and moral maturity to decide for themselves, we must not just be coercive or manipulative. Otherwise, they'll grow up to be coercive and manipulative adults. I did have one experience that brought this home to me. I was up Provo Canyon at a picnic with a group of families. It was a springtime when the runoff of the Provo River was quite high. The river was quite dangerous, but the river was attracting these kids to come to the banks of the river and watch it. And I would observe how parents would, come to get their child away from this dangerous riverbank. Some parents would rush over and they would spank their child and drag them away, using coercion, if you will, to get them to stay away from the river. Other parents would be manipulative. They would grab their child and say in a stern voice that if they ever went back to the river, that some horrible thing would happen to them, meaning they would leave the picnic and not come back, whatever it might be. But it was using deception. Then I noticed one parent who went over to their child by the riverbank. The parent knelt down by the child and put their arm around the child, and then they picked up a stick and threw the stick into the river. It was quite a dramatic sight. The stick was picked up by the current of the river. It hit a rock. It broke into two. One part of the stick flew into the air. The other was submerged into the river. Again, quite a dramatic scene. And the parent said to their child, if you fell into the river, that's what would happen to you. And we don't want that to happen to you, do we? And the child shook its head, no. And they walked away. I would say that that's more of a persuasive use, giving reasons, right? I mean, logos is to give reasons for why they should cooperate with you. Now, I noticed over the time of that evening that those children who had been coerced or manipulated, that they would always look to see if their parents were watching, and if their parents weren't watching, they would sneak back to the riverbank. Whereas the child who had been persuaded, in a sense, to stay away, that was the only child that actually stayed away. That really struck me, that even with a young child, this attempt to use persuasion was still more effective. That's perhaps, I already saw that. Let's take a look at these three ways of exercising persuasion. So logos is an appeal to logic. In logos, you're giving reasons why cooperating with you will help them be safe, secure, respected, and free, able to better accomplish their goals in life. So giving them real reasons why it makes sense to cooperate with you. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. You want to be sure that in your presence they feel safe, secure, respected, and free. And you do this by sincerely listening to their concerns, right? With logos, right? I mean, it's not persuasive to say, do it because I said, but we need to have genuine reasons. And if you can't think of any genuine reasons, then maybe you shouldn't be asking. With pathos, right? In fact, there is on Canvas, if you've noticed, there's a handout on Canvas. It kind of goes over some guidelines for this type of sincere communication. But the best way to influence someone is to really listen to them. Let them know that you understand their concerns and needs. And finally, we come to ethos, an appeal to character. They see you as a trustworthy person. Walt Whitman once said that we persuade by our presence. And this brings us back to graceful presence. If you've become a person of calm self-confidence, emotional resilience, cheerfulness, with that loving and engaging enthusiasm for life, your presence will persuade others. So that brings this mini lecture on Care for Community to a close. Today we talked about what community is, the need to balance freedom and cooperation, and to develop the mindset of the figurative monkey rope. And we discussed the way we exercise power in our communities to get others to cooperate with us. And the key point was that we wanted to cultivate the persuasive use of power, logos, pathos, and ethos. The access code, by the way, for the quiz this week, quiz 1, week 13 on power, is 1125. So with that, I will thank you for your listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.